Hi, I'm Adam Zonder, the production manager for the Hangar Theater Company, and welcome to another episode of In Good Spirits. As we have gone virtual for the 2020 summer season and everyone is working from home, I'm currently sitting in an empty theater, which is odd considering it is summertime. However, between the ongoing pandemic and this being my 25th season with the Hangar, we thought having some conversations with the various designers and technicians with whom I have worked over the years would be fun and in good spirits. I would like to take a moment to give a big thank you to our series sponsor, Myer Farm Distillers, located in Ovid, New York. Joe and his team produced various award-winning vodkas, gins, and my personal favorite, bourbon. Please check them out at MyerFarmDistillers.com. Today's conversation is with set and lighting designer Steve TenEyck. How are things going today, Steve?
Things are good. It's hot in Ithaca. I'm normally in a theater right now, but now I'm in my bedroom.
Yep.
So, as we're all doing, but I'm doing well. Thank you.
Good. So let's start at the beginning. When did you decide to go into theater and specifically design?
Man, that's a really good question. My dawning moment in theater. So I've been around performing arts most of my life. My parents were separated, and my father, who I did not live with, and his stepmother were heavily involved in community theater. So anytime we visited them, we were just around the theater. So I sort of think that's where I was exposed to theater, and I remember watching them perform. And my dad was a musician, so he would often play. I remember a seminal production of Godspell when I was like in second grade. When I was in sort of late elementary school, middle school, high school, I got heavily involved with a ballet company working backstage. And that led to getting involved in sort of a summer theater touring production, which then sort of propelled me into high school theater. So lo and behold, when I came to graduate from high school and choose a major, I was really interested in either going into music or going into theater. And I sort of chose theater randomly, mainly because I felt like I knew if I was going to be a music major, I would spend a lot of time alone in a music practice room. And I don't like being alone. So I didn't want to be alone. And so I chose theater, and lo and behold, I spent a lot of time alone by myself drafting or designing. So that was not really the right choice. I went to undergraduate as a theater major, and just kept working at it and have loved it ever since. I think the moment in the theater that was the most sort of meaningful for me, besides that Godspell production, was I remember seeing a production of Les Miserables and just being floored with the ways in which design and performance could come together to tell a story. And if anything, has been the emotional sort of drive for me, is to create theater that all the elements sort of blend and blur and come together for a moment in the theater when an audience member is transported and taken to places they haven't been before. So that's what I strive for. It's pretty elusive, especially as a theater practitioner. I'm not very often able to be that kind of audience member myself. So I don't even know if the work that I do does that, but that's what I try to do, is try to create theater that transports audience members in a way that helps them to sort of forget where they are, but also conveys stories that are important to tell. So that's sort of my favorite work. So that's my dawning moment in theater, my dad, I guess, and my stepmother, but sort of have been involved ever since then. Yeah.
So you do both scenery design and lighting design. And you said you chose theater when you went to college as a major. Was it to do design, or was it just theater in general and you sort of fell into the design part?
No, I was sort of I knew production was what I wanted to do. And the program, I came in interested in lighting design as an undergraduate. And to be truthful, I think that was because the work that I did with this ballet company was mostly lighting. So I was really fascinated with lighting fixtures and color and like how things were controlled, and what it does on people's bodies, and what it does to space, and how the mood can be changed ever so quickly. And so all those things were really fascinating to me. And then when I got to college, that was, I sort of focused on lighting, but I also had to take set design. And then I sort of had a mentor in set design that I really, really admired, and hadn't really thought about scenery too much until college. So I wound up sort of studying both in school. And the degree I was in didn't make me choose, so there was no sort of box that I had to check. But I wound up exploring both of them pretty heavily. When I went to graduate school, I wound up going to a program where I could both study lighting and scenery. That became really important to me in graduate school. Not all graduate schools will let you do that.
And that was University of Washington, right?
Correct. So I went there as a lighting student, but I went predominantly because I could also study scenery. So I've been sort of doing both. And so my degree is officially in stage lighting design. I'm part of the union as a lighting designer, but I also design scenery. And actually more recently, I've been doing more scenery than lighting. So just by the nature of the opportunities.
So on a lot of shows, you do both.
Correct.
How do you balance doing two designs at the same time?
For me, I'd actually prefer to do both if I can. I mean, you've been really good about, on projects where it's probably not possible, not even offering.
Yeah.
So, like, oh no, maybe you shouldn't do sets for that massive musical and light it as well. But for the projects where it's possible, and I think, of the disciplines that you can combine, lighting and scenery, it's actually quite easy to do both. I mean, there are very few moments when I actually get in arguments with myself about which discipline I should do, or what choice I should make. And I find it to be really satisfying, because a lot of the work you do in pre-production, the text analysis, the collaborating with the director, the sort of considering what the story you want to tell, the planning about how to do it, is the same for scenery and lighting. And they can actually inform one another. You can design sets that allow for a specific type of light, and you can design lighting that is actually conforming to a certain type of scenery. So I find that in many regards, it's actually easier for me to do both, or at least it's not doubly as hard to do both, for sure. It's a lot of the work duplicates, especially the sort of pre-production stuff.
How do you keep your interest in a show then? Because the time frame for both of them is so spread out, with scenery usually 2 to 3 months before lighting actually happens.
Yeah, if anything, I find that as a lighting designer, because the process is so short, you're not really obligated to deliver anything until, it depends on the theater, but much closer to the time that the play goes up than you are scenery. If anything, it keeps me more engaged as a lighting designer, because I'm engaged in a much deeper way earlier. When I'm designing scenery, I'm thinking about it from a much different perspective. So I find that it actually makes my lighting better to be doing scenery, because I'm actually thinking about the play for longer in more in-depth ways. And I'm having conversations, when I'm having conversations with a director about the set, those discussions actually inform my lighting. And if I were just lighting it, I might not be privy to those conversations. So I don't think that I've ever been in a place where I lose interest. If anything, I gain interest. And my lighting choices are more informed than they would be otherwise. And it's not for lack of interest. It's just time. So, we're all really busy. And as a lighting designer, as a professional lighting designer, you tend to do more productions than a set designer does, if that's all that you're doing, because your timeframes are compressed. But if you're doing both, then I can actually, my lighting is more informed by the sets that I do. So, yeah.
So you mentioned that there's times that, I purposely won't talk to you about doing both shows. I don't think it's a good idea that you would design both on a show. Has there been a time where you agreed to do both and realized it was a bad choice?
That's a good question. So I designed a Salome, the opera for Minnesota Opera, and I designed lights and scenery. And the set wound up morphing into large scale projections, like 30 feet by 60 foot projections. And that was a moment where it became clear that I was actually doing 3 things, not 2 things. And that was a moment where and the work of projections is very similar to the work of lighting, in as much of the fine tuning of it, if not the bulk of the big work, happens in the space.
Mm-hmm.
So it became pretty clear that I wasn't going to be capable of that. And in that process, the theater was able to bring on a projection designer. So I sort of got through the director and I got through the storyboard of sort of what the projections would be, but then we had to like say, we need to bring somebody else on to do this work. So that's the only time when it felt like both of them it was hard to do all 3 of them. I've done a bunch of event work, like large scale events, where I've done scenery and lighting. And when it gets into multiple venues, I've had to hire a lot of associates or assistants to help me just physically do the work, because you can't be in more than one place at once.
Right.
And in those, the sequencing of the, for lack of a better word, the trades in those events. If I were just doing one, I could probably be where I needed to be when I needed to be. But because scenery was getting loaded in, lighting gets loaded in, then scenery gets loaded in, then lighting focuses, I couldn't be, sequencing in the same way. So that was really hard. I don't think the work suffered, but it just becomes, you have to delegate and hire some really good people who you trust.
As most of us have to.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in the theater, the example that I would think about the Hangar, the production I designed for Other Desert Cities and for The Foreigner, they weren't complicated sets, but they were highly dressed sets. And, at the Hangar, the lighting notes happen in the same time that the set dressing notes happen. And thankfully, the Hangar has a great lab program. Is that what we still call it, the lab company?
The design fellows, yeah.
The design fellows. And in both of those circumstances, those design fellows were totally invaluable. I think it was also good for them because they were able to take some ownership. But those are moments where I can't be in 2 places at once. And sometimes, similarly, I've had to have a design fellow at the Hangar maybe do some lighting notes while I'm doing a set note. So you sort of have to thread that needle. But if you have people to help you, it's not hard. It's when you don't have that, it becomes it's just impossible.
Right. So your first season at the Hangar was in 2008. You did both the set design for the school tour production of The Truth About Dinosaurs and the summer production of The Overwhelming. Do you have any recollections of either of those shows?
I do. I remember both of them very well. Yeah. So the dinosaur show, what was that called again?
The Truth About Dinosaurs.
The Truth About, that was such a great piece. So that was with Wendy Dan, who I love working with and have a long-standing sort of collaboration with. That production particularly wasn't challenging, but I've done a number of school tours since, and that is its own special beast. In as much as thinking about scenery that is both durable, that you can fit into a van, that can move around on multiple spaces, and has an interest to that age group, are all sort of external parameters that aren't often placed, or at least not in the, when you're in a theater, are not placed on the work in that way. So I find that, I like working with parameters, but sometimes it's like, oh, right, okay, it has to fit into a van. Oh, right, it has to fit through a 6-foot or 7-foot door. Oh, right, it needs to like move in and out and in and out and in and out. And I've done enough school tours now where I've made mistakes that it's like, yeah, we're not doing 12 feet anymore because that doesn't exist in some cafetoriums or whatever. But that particular production I thought was a great piece. And Wendy and I had a lot of fun sort of thinking about the visual world of that piece. And I love the fact that there's still a dinosaur in the shop. And
yes,
so it reminds me of that show. And then The Overwhelming, I had worked with Bob Moss before coming to the Hangar. And so if I remember correctly, he was directing that show and he brought me in on that particular production, which was a great play. But that play, what I remember about that play is the set that we designed was very different than the set that the audience saw. I mean, the basic core was there, But there were things that we had designed in the process, like the floor bleeding, that I know your staff spent a lot of time rigging up. How does blood come out of a floor when you want it
Right.
to, and how does it not go everywhere, and the costumes implications. And we also designed all this floating scenery that would come and go to help establish location. And basically every day of tech was Bob looking at me and me looking at Bob saying, yeah, we don't need that. Yeah, we don't need that. Yeah, we don't need that. Which I think was really a positive response to what we were seeing in terms of storytelling. But it's always hard to sort of, invest months and months and months in these objects and then all this time to make them happen and then be like, okay, that's not the best choice. I think it's good. It's part of the process. It's what I love about theater. But that's what I remember from that production, that we basically ended with the shell without all of the accoutrement. But it was it was the best for the play. And by the way, that's not the first time that's happened with Bob with me. That's happened multiple times with Bob. So that probably says more about our relationship and how what we do in the design process than it does about anything else. So.
And subtracting is always easier than adding at that stage.
It's true. Absolutely. But that's a great play. And I'm glad we did it.
Good. So you've done a wide range of shows for the Hangar, both dramas like Doll's House Part 2 and large scale musicals like Kinky Boots.
Right.
How's your approach different from a drama to a large scale musical?
Well, musicals are their own special beast. And the thing about musicals for me as a set designer is that you sort of have to lean into and acknowledge and figure out what the machine is, almost either alongside or before you actually figure out what it looks like. So I remember, when I first said yes to Kinky Boots, I didn't know anything about it. I think I told you the story before, Adam, but maybe I haven't. I was like, how hard can it be? It's in a shoe factory. I knew that much about it. And then I read the play and I was like, oh my gosh, it's like 47 scenes. I didn't have any conceit that it was that complicated. So you sort of have to figure out, okay, if it's going to be 47 scenes and you're in a theater that actually doesn't have very much scenery delivery device sort of embedded in the architecture like you would with a fly house or something of that nature. Just figuring out how stuff comes and goes, and if stuff should come and go, is a question you sort of need to ask before you ask, what color is the brick and are there windows or whatever. So I find with musicals, I work in ground plan pretty quickly to think about literally how this thing moves. And the same thing is actually true with opera. And if it's a piece that's been done before, you have the luxury of having perhaps a recording of it that you can literally on a piece of paper write down, okay, scene 1 is 10 minutes, and then there's a 2-minute transition. Scene 3 is 30 seconds. That transition, if there's music, is 15 seconds. In opera, those transitions are non-negotiable. In the theater, you can sort of make that 30-second transition and make it, what we call vamp. The band has the ability to play it over and over and over again. In opera, they don't. They will not vamp in opera. So knowing what those transition moments are is really helpful, and knowing how long each scene is really important. Because when it actually comes down to it, you're like, oh, right, well, that scene is actually only, a page long. So we don't really need all of this energy and all of this stuff to make that thing work. We can probably get away with less or whatever. So I think in musicals, thinking through the machine of it is really important, to just plot out how it's built. In the history of musical theater, in the sort of the golden era of musical theater, musicals were written so that you would have large scale, big scenic ideas, and then a curtain or a drop would come in and there would be a scene downstage of that where they could change the set. And I think so they called those in-one scenes. And I think recognizing that that's how those musicals are built is actually super important when you design them, so that you don't design the in-one as a large set and then what was meant to be a large set as so you actually follow it backwards. Right. You follow the guidebook. Plays are less, some plays are similar. If you have a really episodic play that goes all over the place, and the Hangar has done a lot of those too, you do have to think about the machinery as well. Like a Doll's House Part 2, you don't need to do that. It's a single set. So you're thinking much more about initially the world of the play, Sort of what does the space do for the story, for the actors in the story? What's the right proportion of space to people? How does it confine or release the energy of the play? What is the metaphor of the set? And not that you don't ask those questions when you design a musical, you're just asking them perhaps a little later or alongside the conversation about the machinery of it. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So you were talking about a little bit of a difference between opera and musical theater. In musical theater, we can expand or contract some of the change time because the musicians can vamp and whatnot. And in
Right.
opera, you said that can't happen. What are some of the other differences, since you obviously also design a lot of opera?
Well, I think what's interesting in opera is that it's a whole different flowchart. So in theater, in musical theater, the director is the director and the musical director is the musical director. And often the musical director on a flowchart is below the stage director. So, and what does that mean? It means that the stage director decides that the actor is downstage left and they have this set around them, and then the music director will then figure out how to make that work. In opera, believe it or not, the maestro or conductor is above the director on the food chain. So what does that mean? It means that what's important for music actually is most important. Not that I've been in an opera where the maestro has been a part of the design process, but I've also been in processes where they are not part of that process at all. So I remember in graduate school, I was designing a Cendrillon where we had designed, I don't know if it's the Cinderella of the opera, and we designed the whole opera around this image of the fairy godmother in a tree upstage center, because one of the acts was in the forest. And we spent a year designing it, building it, loading it in. We were in the middle of tech, and we get to the fairy godmother moment, and the maestro dropped his baton and looked out in the theater and said, "She cannot be up there. I cannot hear her. She cannot see me." And basically took her out of the tree, put her downstage center, and that's the way it was going to be, because that's the way the maestro needed it to be for the music. It didn't matter what we had planned for, what we were, and you obviously work through those moments, but you just realize that what's most important is the way that the music is being delivered and being handled, and the staging and the scenery and the lighting is all secondary to that primary function. And obviously you want it to all be together, but if there's a moment where there's a conflict, it's the music that's going to actually tell us what we need to do. So there's also considerations like tech time is shorter, because it's more expensive to mount because there's more people involved. Oftentimes when designing scenery, there's an issue of acoustics that you don't really think about with, you think about with musical theater, but not to the extent that you think about it with opera. An all soft set is not that helpful for opera. You need surfaces that reflect sound and
right, because the opera singers are not wearing mics.
Correct.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So currently you're a professor in the theater department at Ithaca College.
Yep.
Why did you make the decision to go into academia?
That's a good question. So I knew from very early that I wanted to teach. So when I graduated from undergraduate, which was UC Santa Barbara, the UC system had done an early retirement scheme for the entire system, which I think is 9 campuses now. I think then it was 8. And they were not, more faculty took advantage of them than they were anticipating. And one of the faculty that took advantage of it happened to be my lighting design professor. So they asked me if I would come back and teach a couple of, master classes or whatever, because I was in the area. And I sort of fell in love with teaching. So I wound up teaching at the University of California for 5 years after graduating undergraduate, teaching in the lighting program. And realized that I really loved teaching. I also liked professional work, but as a person, I wasn't that interested in living the life of a freelance artist. I knew I wanted to have a family, which requires some stability. As a person, I knew that sort of having a consistent paycheck was important to me. So I was interested in, and I actually explored other avenues. I explored sort of architectural lighting and other things, which I sort of did some work in those fields as well. But I still loved theater. So when I went to graduate school, I knew that I wanted to eventually teach. But in that era, which was the sort of late 90s, telling graduate schools that you wanted to be a teacher was not something you did, because graduate schools were not interested in producing teachers. They were interested in producing professionals. At least the graduate school, this is true for University of Washington in that moment of history. So I had to sort of keep it under my lid as I was, in graduate school. But it was something I always knew I wanted to do. So when I graduated from graduate school, I actually went looking for a teaching post. And of all the places that I interviewed and offered me a position, Ithaca College was the most exciting, predominantly because of the students that tend to go to Ithaca College. It's a great program. It's been around for a long time. It attracts a pretty hungry student who loves, who wants to be involved in the work, and who is interested in dedicating their time to doing what it takes to get there. So they're pretty driven and pretty passionate. It's a pretty high impact sport at Ithaca College, so I really like it. And so I've been there since 2001.
Great.
So, yeah.
So in terms of working with students in academia, how do you balance mentoring a student on the design of a show with letting them learn and sometimes having to let them, fail a little bit?
That's a really good question. And I think that my feelings on this have changed over time, or at least my approach to it has changed over time. I think when I first started teaching, I was really interested in not, maybe interest is not the right word. I was really concerned with what it actually wound up looking like. So I spent a lot of energy trying to help the students see that in the moment, which was both successful and I think at some moments stressful for the student. I think, fast forward 20 years, I think I'm much more interested in process than I am product now. And that the students are engaging in a process, and if what it looks like is what it looks like. So if the designer is engaged in the process, and the student technicians are engaged in the process, and the designer is collaborating with their other designers and collaborating with the director, and the director seems pleased with what's going on, my opinion with what it looks like is really sort of irrelevant. That was not necessarily true in 2001. I'd be like, well, don't you think it should be blue? Or, sort of like, and I think there's value in that, but because there's, I think there's always value in understanding others' perspectives. But I think I've become more of a facilitator over time than I perhaps was when I first started. But it is you were involved highly and still are in education, so that's a needle you need to thread constantly about process versus product in this discipline. So, but I think that's where I am today. Yeah.
Great. So a couple of times with designing shows at the Hangar, specifically Clybourne Park and Tally's Folly, you were actually part of a design team that included some of your former students. Kara Harmon on Clybourne Park and David Arsenault on Tally's Folly.
Absolutely.
How was that experience working with former students now as, part of the actual design team outside of academia?
Well, my highest hope for my students is that they become my collaborators. So those are actually sort of the things that I live for. I really enjoy it. What's great about it is that you get to see your former students sort of doing what they came to school to do. And you hoped you had some effect on them, and that you contributed in some way. So it's really, it's a moment of I don't know if pride's the right word, but I am proud of those students about the work that they're doing. It's great to be in as a collaborator with them and to transition into that relationship. I mean, I've worked a lot with David since then, for other theaters and other venues, and it's super exciting. And I also think that there is a when you work with new people, there's always the process of sort of learning how to talk to one another and learning the language of one another. So when you work with a former student, you already have a relationship with them. So that part becomes easy because you can, you have a shared vocabulary. And, I, for example, for both of those students, when they were students, I understood where they were coming from, having been with them for 4 years. They sort of understood where I came from. So I hope that I don't have much of an issue with changing the dynamic of the relationship. I'd be curious to see what they say. But having worked with both of them, I think, have I worked with Kara before? I think that may have been the only time, but I've worked with an alum in a number of ways after they graduate, and they're always super enjoyable. What's amazing sometimes is you walk into a theater and you're like, wait a minute, I didn't know you worked here. Like, okay, that's really cool. So
Yep. Because theater is such a small world.
absolutely.
Earlier, you mentioned some of the non-theater related things that you've worked on, some of the large-scale events, and you've done things like commencement ceremonies, campaign, fundraising events, and even a talk by Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Right.
How do events like those work?
Well, it's not dissimilar to theater. It's just, it's all about storytelling. With all of those events, there was a particular story that each institution, I mean, the events I do are predominantly academic. So so I'm not doing like Super Bowls or, fashion shows but in the corporate event world, we're still interested in storytelling. So what is the storytelling that we're interested in for a campaign kickoff or for a presidential inauguration or whatever? So there is a consideration of audience. There's a consideration of what's the messaging you're trying to sort of convey. And then you design around those things. What differs is the scale. When you're doing dinner for 1,000 in a stadium, that's very different than designing Doll's House at the Hangar. So you're dealing with different scales. You're often dealing with venues that don't have infrastructure. So you have to bring in things like truss and motors, and then you have to worry about where you can hang them. So that often will dictate where stages go. So sometimes when the design process, I'm really thinking about where can I put motors before I think about where does the stage go. And it's just a matter of sequencing, right? You're having to design the infrastructure and then design the thing that the infrastructure can hold. What's also hard is that you're often dealing with, or sometimes you're dealing with crew that may not really either know much about theater or really care much about what you're doing. So the great thing about the theater is that it's sort of a value-driven adventure. People are in theater because they're interested in the mission of the theater, or they're interested in the particular play, and they're committed to that thing. And most people in the theater aren't, they're not in it for the money, really. People do get paid, but it's not about that. It's about really being connected to the work. So you're all coming at it from that direction. When you're doing event work, oftentimes people who are working on those are sort of perhaps stagehands or other folks who are hired just to come put in the time. Right. And they may change, right? The crew you have this morning will be a different crew than you have this afternoon, and they're just going to go home when they're done, and they don't even know what you're doing, because when the event goes out of the hall today, tomorrow a new event will come in and will be complete. So that's often a challenge that you're having to sort of engender goodwill amongst folks who really may not have any idea what you're doing nor really care. So that I find that challenging. It's just a different dynamic. But it's fun because you often get to work and really, really, how often do you get to like Justice Ginsburg, right? That's pretty cool. Like that, and she was amazing. But like that, just as an example, that particular event happened very quickly. That institution thought they were going to do it for 200 or 300 people. Then they realized they had thousands of people who wanted to come see. So they hired a company.
Really? I'm shocked.
Yeah, exactly. So, it was 2-week turnaround, and then you can imagine a production like that when you have a sort of a guest who has a lot of security around. There was all sorts of security things that we had to deal with, in terms of locking the space down, and, sniff dogs, and, state police, and, U.S. Marshals, and all that sort of stuff. But so they're different things. You don't think about necessarily those things when you're designing, at the Hangar Theater.
Right. Good, I think.
Exactly. No, it's just different. So, but it's fun. It's a lot of fun.
So based on the current state of theater and the pandemic, where do you think theater's going to be heading when we can actually recongregate and spend time with each other?
Oh my God, it's such a good question. It's so hard. It seems like every theater that I have a relationship with has in terms of live theater, I'm not going to talk, the virtual stuff that we're doing, I think is great. But in terms of live theater, it seems like everybody has said, let's just press pause and reconstitute in a year.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, I hope that comes to fruition. I really hope that we're able to reconstitute. I mean, these are the conversations we're having with the college right now too, is like, how do we do what we do when what we do requires that we be together, and right now that's not safe. I believe that what I love about theater is an actor and an audience member, that relationship. So I hope that we get back to that place where we're able to have audience and actors in the same space together. So I hope that's where, I hope that happens. In the history of theater, this is not the first time there's been a wrench thrown, right? Like
Nope.
from day one, there's been discussion of the theater as a dying art form. I don't believe that it will die. Will it sort of come back in a different form? I absolutely think it will. But will it maintain some of the form that it had? I absolutely think it will. I don't think we're going to have, this is my opinion, I don't think we're going to be a world of all Zoom theater after the pandemic. I think that people want to be in the room with actors. Will there be some things that we can do that we've learned that we can do digitally? I think that will probably happen. There'll be, I think we're now all a little more at ease with the digital environment. So things like, meetings and, things of that nature that would typically, they used to, in theaters that can afford it, they will fly all their people out for a meeting. I think those days are probably sort of over. But I think that also in terms of the work, I think, there'll be things that we probably will lean into the digital environment that might reach audiences that we couldn't previously reach. Or maybe we can produce things we hadn't been able to produce before. So I hope that it expands our programming. It doesn't contract our programming. At least that's my hope. What do you think? I mean,
Well, I think it'll be supplementing. I firmly
Yeah.
believe that we'll be able to start live streaming live shows with an audience in the room as well.
You think that'll happen?
I do, because I think you're going to have, large segments of the population that just don't want to come back, but they still want to experience theater.
Absolutely.
So they can do it safely.
Yep. No, I agree. And, it's interesting. I was on a webinar the other day that the publishers are actually figuring this out right now too. Like, what does it mean to have streaming rights versus large, in the person rights? And so I think that we're all sort of flying the plane and inventing it at the same time. So hopefully we'll all, hopefully the plane will keep flying and we'll be able to land it at some point. But, for me as a designer, I hope and I believe that there will be analog theater in our future, that there will be real props and real sets and real lights and real actors and real costumes with an audience member, and we can supplement in a digital way. So, but I also think there might be a whole segment of theater that winds up being digital. I think, they're not, because I think that we're discovering things about that. So there might be a blended sort of, the things that we're learning, and you're doing way more than I've just read about it. So you're actually doing it now with the Hangar. But the things we're learning in live streaming theater, I think, are really valuable, and there'll be a place for them.
I think so too.
Whether it be whole companies that do nothing but that, or whether it be a way that we workshop things, or whether it be, will this change the rehearsal process? I don't know. These are all really good questions. The rehearsal processes right now, and even in my time in the theater, have gone from a standard regional 6-week rehearsal to now it's a 3-week rehearsal, and that's all economics. So will this somehow contribute to that and make more rehearsal possible? Maybe.
Yeah, it's possible, because you can also be rehearsing with people outside of your area.
Absolutely. So you don't need, and that part of the 6 weeks to 3 weeks in the regional theater has to do with the economics, not just of paying an actor, but also housing an actor and all of those things that go along with it. So if there's a way to sort of reduce the cost, but get be able to do some more work, I think that might be really exciting. So I think that it's a whole thing we haven't even thought about yet. So how does it fit in is yet to be determined. So yeah, that's where I think it's going to go.
Great. Well, thank you. I'd like to once again thank our sponsor, Myer Farm Distillers. Thank you very much for joining me today, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely.